Welcome, everyone, to the Chapman CRE webcast produced by the Hayden School of Real Estate at Chapman University. I'm your host, Stephen Ames. On today's episode, we're taking a deep dive into one of the most important sectors in commercial real estate, the U.S. industrial and logistics market. I'm joined by James Breeze, the head of industrial research for the Americas at CBRE, where he leads research and thought leadership focused on U.S. industrial and logistics sector in the Americas. James is one of the leading research voices behind industrial real estate today, combining brokerage experience, institutional market analysis, and deep expertise in logistics and supply chain trends. Today, we'll discuss themes emerging from CBRE's latest report, The State of the U.S. Industrial and Logistics Market, and what all this means to investors, developers, occupiers, and the next generation of real estate leaders. James, welcome to the Chapman CRE webcast.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Really excited, and it's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. And why don't we start today with the broader backdrop shaping the industrial market?
Yeah, definitely. So, if you guys get used to spending a lot of time with research people, we definitely have to have our slides to coincide with what we're talking about. So, I'm going to go ahead and share some of our slides that come from a report that Steve just mentioned. But I would say, I've been doing this a very long time. I'm at that point of my life now, I guess, where I've been in research for as long as a lot of college students have frankly been alive, which is a little scary, but I guess gives me some good background as to what this industry's been doing. But I would say that this past year has probably been one of the more interesting that I've ever seen in terms of the change in dynamics and how external and internal fundamentals have really been moving. And I figured I'd start off a little bit, kind of on the big picture, what's going on with the economy, consumer, supply chain, how that's all affecting the industrial market overall. So these are kind of like the big three story points that we're seeing right now. I'll start off kind of in the middle here with the economy. CBRE does do its own economic outlook, and it does point to still subdued GDP growth in 2026 and 2027. We're not projecting a recession despite the growth in inflation and obviously all the geopolitical uncertainty that's going on. But if you look at some surveys, CEO confidence is relatively low, consumer confidence is relatively low. But I would say since COVID, those sentiment marks really have not correlated with consumer performance. I mean, retail sales continue to be solid. And that's frankly the top statistic that we look at or that I look at industrial is if people are buying stuff, you still have to flow that inventory through warehouses. You still have to make sure that store shelves are stocked. And that's kind of the key to the industry. But there's a lot of other things that are really affecting decision making as to how much inventory do we have? Where do we put that inventory? Where do we grow? Where do we consolidate? And so right now, I'd say the other two factors that are really affecting decision making are essentially number one and number three. Supply chain costs are definitely on the rise, and I'll show some stats on that. And also population growth, e-commerce, that's continuing to affect decision making also on the positive. So I'll show a little bit about where we're seeing that. And this is a lot of stuff, right? And this comes from our supply chain advisory team. But supply chain is like this intricate dance. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years. You needed a supply chain to build the pyramids in Egypt, or most wars through history have been won by controlling the supply chain. And this is the breakdown of the total supply chain costs for an average industrial user. And you can see here that transportation costs, so this is the cost of moving goods around, is probably about half of the total supply chain cost, where rents are about 3 to 6% of total supply chain costs. So interestingly enough, we have actually seen that in times of higher transportation costs, companies actually focus on keeping more inventory domestically so they don't have to move this stuff around. And they actually kind of go away from, say, moving out of certain warehouses because they need to keep it in more locations to cut down on those costs. So it's kind of funny, but in these times of uncertainty and growing transportation costs, it actually kind of creates an insulation for industrial. And so that's something that we're definitely looking for externally.
Always makes me wonder too when I see these kind of numbers. What's all the fuss about rent? Why are people fighting tooth and nail over the
It
difference between $1.10 and $1.12 a square foot?
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, costs are costs, and even though it might be a relatively small portion of the supply chain, you're still going to look at those costs as just, part of it. And so, and we'll talk about that again in a little bit, even though you're seeing some increases in supply, there's also been significant rent increases, and that is part of what affects decisions. But when we get into a point in time when transportation costs are growing much more, we've seen some insulation happen there. On the positive side, again, even though there's this uncertainty, the market as a whole has to prepare for consumer preferences. And e-commerce continues to grow. I think what's interesting to see is that we're actually buying more now as a percent of our total spend than we did when COVID hit. So second quarter 2020, obviously that's when everything happened. E-com as a percent of sales just shot up. It went from like 16% all the way to 21%. The country opened up, we started going back to stores, it dipped down again. But as the quarters have gone on, it has been the slow, steady growth, and now we're at about 24%. So actually a good chunk higher than that point. And we do expect this to grow over the next decade. I mean, some of it is demographic shifts having to do with, younger people becoming a higher portion of that purchasing power. But interesting, we're actually seeing more growth from e-commerce from like the baby boomer retirement age community. Uh, this is a community that is utilizing e-commerce more, say, for food delivery, healthcare delivery, medicines, things like that. And so I think there's a lot of correlation to the growth of that population in certain areas, just as much as say, younger people and Gen Z and whatnot. So these are the markets where we are seeing the growth of e-commerce and the correlating growth in population be positively affected. So essentially, what this shows is how much population is going to grow in the next 5 years in certain areas, and it's still dominated by the Sun Belt, obviously. And these are areas not only where young people are moving to, but also where people are retiring. North Carolina has become a very popular retirement destination. Texas still is, obviously, Florida is. And so not only will industrial have a positive effect, say, for younger people, but also retirees moving here, I think is going to increase the demand for, final mile warehousing. So, all of this is essentially going on, and you can, believe what I say, or if not, you can believe what actual occupiers say. So what we did is we actually conducted an occupier survey through the first quarter of 2026. And, it came up with results that I thought somewhat were not surprising, but there were a few surprising things that did come through it. We talked about costs, and although supply chain costs are high, real estate costs are a major contributor to decisions for occupiers right now. When you're looking at one building or another, one market or another, it really is a huge factor in terms of what the rent and occupancy cost is. The Southeast and the Midwest are the areas where tenants are looking at moving the most. Southeast is population growth, but Midwest really has a lot of logistical advantages. I mean, it's middle America, so third-party logistics providers like to be in that area there, so they can reach a higher portion of the population. But and these are some things we'll talk about again in a bit. We're also seeing this huge growth in manufacturing in the U.S., and a lot of that growth is in Middle America. Also, a lot of growth in manufacturing in Mexico, and so there's a lot of movement of goods along I-35 going up the middle part of the country, and that's also positively affecting the Midwest. And I think that's why a lot of occupiers mention that the Midwest is a place where they would like to expand over the next few years. We were a little surprised that power availability, we talk a lot about power, was not a huge response from tenants in this survey. I do think it's an important thing, but it does seem like overall, like, costs and supply chain advantages are kind of trumping that right now. And we talk about AI a lot also, and I mean I use it a lot more. I'm sure everyone uses it a lot more than they used to, but not a huge decision making factor yet. for industrial tenants. But I do think that that will start to change over the next few years. Again, this is a lot. These are just some of the major takeaways. This report is available on our website if anyone wants to go and look at a little bit more detail. But again, majority of respondents, I think the good news is they did expect to either maintain or expand their footprints over the next 3 years. So I think that's a good sign for the market. We talked about the regional, we talked about a lot about cost. I would say also, big thing that we're seeing in industrial is a lot of outsourcing to third-party logistics providers. In a time of uncertainty, it makes a lot of sense for retailers and wholesalers to, instead of doing their own distribution, of actually outsourcing it to 3PLs who can then handle finding locations, dealing with labor, dealing with these different costs. And so what retailers, wholesalers, food companies do is they just essentially sign a contract with a third party provider to do all that for them. And it creates kind of a little bit more of an insulation from all these changes in the market where if they decide, hey, we don't need as much inventory, we just cancel the contract instead of having to move out of a building, figuring out what you're doing with your labor. And it's created, making 3PLs a very high portion of market share. And, the survey essentially said that that's going to continue over the next few years. Again, this is a little bit more about 3PLs. Most of the respondents said they're either going to use them the same or more over the next 3 years. Also, it looks like about half of the respondents are going to look at either planning to expand or actively expand their manufacturing over the next few years. And that's a big story in the US right now that we'll talk about some more. And then one thing that we're also seeing, we'll talk about it a bit, is there's really been this huge, what we call flight to quality going on in the US. A lot of spaces coming up for lease expiration. And so companies are looking at this could be a time to move into, say, a newer building because there's been a lot of construction going on. And we'll show some data on that. But there is a lot of correlation in our survey that showed that one of the driving factors for site selection is upgrading facilities to a newer facility. But that opportunity is quickly dwindling as some of that new supply is going away, and we'll show some data on that. I think
Driven
that's a
by
huge
clear
story.
height, do you
Yeah.
think, James?
Clear height's a big factor, yes, because there's a lot more use of, say, higher racking due to, automation and, robotics in the warehouse. And so you definitely have to have a higher clear height to utilize that higher racking. And, you need kind of thicker floors for some of this, more in-depth racking systems and whatnot. And so just to better utilize the warehouse in the modern distribution era, you have to have kind of that ability to go higher just as much as going wider. So that's essentially kind of the outside figures. That's essentially the mind of the occupier. So how does this actually affecting the stats for industrial? I would say, kind of big three things right now, and I'm not going to read all of this. Leasing activity is really in a record-breaking run right now. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. Pro-manufacturing legislation that we've seen over the last two administrations is now starting to actually make its way through into our industrial statistics. But even though we've seen a lot of great leasing, there is a lot of space coming back onto the market, especially older space. And we'll talk about how much and why that is, over the next few minutes. So I guess good news first is that, we are seeing a lot of lease transaction volume. So lease transactions are both new leases and renewals combined. And we track at CB about 62 markets across the United States. And so these numbers are the combination of all 62 of those markets. Last year, leasing activity was up about 12%. We actually thought that leasing was going to be down 5. So that was a pretty big, miss on our part. And so we were like, well, what did we miss? Because we usually look at, economic sentiment and retailer sentiment and frankly, broker and investor sentiment. And everything pointed to a bit of a slowdown because you got to remember, we weren't really sure what was going to happen with tariffs and the general economy with the new administration coming in. So we thought there'd be a little bit of a pause. But leasing went up 12%. So we were like, well, why was that? And a lot of it really had to do with, even though there was so much uncertainty, companies essentially just had to make decisions because, again, and we'll show some data on this, so much space is coming up for renewal over the next few years that it doesn't matter if you don't know what you're going to do. When your lease is up, you have to do something, right? You either have to sign a new lease or you have to renew. And this is just creating a massive amount of overall volume. And that seems to be continuing this year. So this is leasing in first quarter. And the first quarter leasing is up about 14. What we are seeing is that the larger building deals, these tend to be like your Amazons and big retailers. Those are doing really well right now. A lot more of those spaces are coming up for renewal over the next few years, and that's kind of bringing those occupiers back into the market. So just to put that in perspective, a million square foot building, I mean, these are huge buildings, right? 23 of those buildings leased in first quarter of 2026. First quarter 2025, only 3 of those buildings leased. And so you're starting to see that a lot more demand now starting to come for those larger buildings, and that's positively affecting the overall numbers. And so we're actually projecting, and this is our leasing activity totals broken out by new leasing and renewals. And our new forecast is that actually 2026 is going to be the strongest year ever for leasing activity. So we actually think there's going to be more volume this year than there was in 2021. Now, again, I kind of highlighted, the top numbers for both new leasing and renewals. And we actually think that this year will be record breaking because there's going to be so many renewals, because there's so much space coming up for expiration.
Just to make a distinction here for people that are
Yeah,
listening, there's a big difference between leasing activity and net absorption,
yeah,
and that's what's kind of happening, I think.
definitely. Yeah, and that'll go. That's part of the bad news. We're talking about the good news, but the bad news, which I'll show some data on in a bit, is that typically when there's great leasing, there's also great net absorption. So for those of you who don't know, net absorption is the change in occupied space from one point of time to another. So if you have more occupied space, say in second quarter than you did in first quarter, that's considered positive absorption. If you have less occupied space in second quarter than first quarter, that's negative absorption. And from an investor standpoint, absorption is a much more important statistic than leasing actually is, because absorption points to how much space are we getting rent for. It's occupancy levels. And so there could be a lot of transaction volume, that's great. But if it's also leading to a lot of move outs and your occupancy rate is still low, you're still not getting the rent that you want in your total portfolio. So leasing's great, I think, from a real estate company perspective, because obviously we make commissions and that helps out. But for an investor, it's really about the occupancy number. And that one's been relatively flat, which I'll show you some stats for in a couple of slides here. Again, the big 3 things that we're seeing: huge flight to quality right now. That's definitely affecting the numbers. A lot of renewals, about 32% of total activity this year we expect to be renewals. And 3PL outsourcing is definitely driving the market. About 34% of total activity is coming from 3PLs. And this is a little bit more of a background in terms of who's leasing space. And so this is total lease transaction volume first quarter 26 versus first quarter 25. And about 34% again of deals were signed by third-party logistics providers. So you can see that 3PLs are growing, but the general retail wholesale market share is starting to deplete. And that kind of showcases you that more and more of these retailers and wholesalers are outsourcing to 3PLs. And so that's affecting that total share. But I think, again, the really big story is that manufacturing number, the third number down, and that's up significantly compared with first quarter 2025. So there's actually now more manufacturing leasing going on than, say, food and beverage companies or automobile companies. And that's, a really big thing for the market, that's growing. And so, why is there so much more manufacturing leasing? And I think, just to kind of go back real quick, if you're leasing manufacturing space, that tends to be a lighter manufacturing use. It's typically what we call support manufacturing, where, say, you're, building components that go into factories, like a semiconductor plant or a data center or an auto plant. You're not going to lease those buildings, right? Those are build to suits. You're never going to move. And so that's not part of that leasing activity. But leasing is a little bit more of a support to some of this huge manufacturing. But what's kind of driving that is, different legislation. These are kind of a few, three big bills that have been passed over the last two administrations, and we're starting to see all three of these start to kind of make its way into decision making and positively affect the market as a whole. And this is kind of the breakdown of that manufacturing leasing. And while we've seen, a really big pickup in aerospace and defense, that's actually really helping Southern California. Kind of interesting stat is that in first quarter of 26, Los Angeles was actually the number one market for manufacturing leasing in the country. I mean, typically you think of Chicago or, some of these Midwest areas or Dallas, but because of, kind of the resurgence of the South Bay, as a manufacturing hub, a lot of it having to do with drone manufacturing that's growing there. LA did very well for first quarter. But the number one overall product type for manufacturing growth has been data center components. I mean, we all hear about data centers, they're going everywhere. And so you need to service these data centers. You need to make sure that you have the parts and components for the cooling systems. You need to have a separate area where you build or maintain the servers. And so we're seeing a ton of like surrounding demand, and this is kind of that light industrial support demand or light manufacturing support demand for data centers. And so that's been a really large part of what I would say, net growth from leasing so far this year. And this is kind of, again, just showcase really how 3PLs affect the markets. I'll just go through this real quick. These are the top 10 most active markets for leasing so far this year. And you can see 8 out of the top 10 markets, 3PLs really kind of dominate activity. Like 43% of all the leasing in the Inland Empire is done by a third party logistics provider. So that's, a really huge portion of total activity. But now let's kind of get into that bad news supply part that, even though there's been a ton of leasing, we've seen relatively low positive absorption. Absorption is the lowest that it's been in 10 years, and vacancies are the highest that they've been in about 12 years. And so it's like, well, why, when you're seeing all this great leasing activity, is there not any kind of reciprocal drop in supply? I mean, that's econ 101, increased demand, supply goes down. Well, we're not really seeing that. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of the demand overall is what I call musical chair demand, where companies aren't saying like, oh, I have 2 million square feet. Now I need 3 million square feet. It's more of, I have 2 million square feet. Now I want to see, since that 2 million square feet's coming up for lease expiration, what kind of 2 million square feet do I want? Do I want to stay in my 2 million square feet? Or do I take this opportunity to say, move into a brand new 2 million square feet? And because there's been so much construction, and you can see this on the chart, which, it's the lighter green bar. That's all of the construction completions there's been, billions of square feet of development. There's a lot of opportunity to essentially move into a new building. And so because of that, we've seen great activity, but we've also seen a lot of move outs of older space. And that's kind of showcased in this
That
chart.
chart
Yeah.
is great. It actually shows the demand that came right out of COVID and
Yeah.
all the safety stock space that was leased by different companies. You can see it just skyrocketing there.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
drove vacancies down to virtually zero in certain markets and rents up 30%.
Definitely. Yeah. And so that was what we call, net expansion, right? That was, I have again 2 million square feet, but I ran out of all of my inventory. And because there's so much uncertainty in the market, I need to have 3 or 4 million square feet so I don't run out of stock again. And so that going from that 2 to 3, and I'm just using these as, example numbers, is what created, huge amounts of positive absorption and record low vacancies. It got down to like 2.9. And like you said, rents were up like 20, 30%. Inland Empire rents like doubled like in 2 years. And so it was crazy. But now it's like, it's 5 years later, and all of those companies that went from 2 to 3 are deciding, well, do I really need that 3? And what am I going to do, with that 3 now? So it's different. It's kind of, it's this new cycle of decision making because now a lot of these leases are coming up. And so, this is absorption by building age. And again, if you have a negative number, there's more companies moving out of space than moving into space. And what we've seen is that we've had negative absorption in any building that's older than 2020. And so this is showing that a lot of companies are consolidating out of older buildings. Well, really good positive absorption in new buildings. And over the last 3 years, we've actually posted about 400 million square feet of negative absorption in buildings built pre 2020. So there's 400 million square feet now of more vacant space on the market that's second generation and older. And so that's a huge thing right now for investors in terms of, what are we going to do with this space? Are we going to, renovate it to make it more modern? Are we going to look at maybe selling it to users? Do we just need, a new marketing campaign? Do we just wait out, all of this new space? And once it gets leased up, our building will be a little bit more attractive. I mean, a huge amount of decisions being made or having to be made for the space that's coming on the market. Now, like I said, the market is running out of first gen space, and this showcases it here. And this is the total amount of under construction space in the U.S. And so there's only about 237 million square feet under construction right now. 3 years ago, there was 667 million square feet under construction. And right now, over 40% of what's under construction is already spoken for. So very little first generation space on the market when that's the space that's most in demand. And so that, it's kind of an interesting dynamic right now for the market.
It's driving decisions to start projects because people are sort of making the bet that net absorption will return and there will be a huge dearth of supply because of the pipeline sort of collapsing. And so I'm going to be the smart one, get my project up and reap the benefits of that, a year and a half from now.
Definitely. If
Seeing
you
that.
have the ability to break ground on a new project, now would be a great time. The problem is that it's very difficult to break ground on a new project because it's very hard to get construction financing right now. Higher interest rates, land costs are very high. So it's very high to kind of pencil in that new development, even though there's so much of a need for it. We're already at record high rent. So how can you, underwrite, rent growth? And so outside of markets where, say, land costs are lower, like Dallas or Houston, it's really hard to break ground on a building. Build to suits maybe a little bit easier to do, where you already have that occupier in mind, but spec is still really difficult. And so kind of like what you're saying is that tenants right now are saying, okay, my lease might not be up for 2 to 3 years, but this might be like my last chance to lease a new building. And so they're kind of jumping on these new buildings right now. And it's creating a lot of volume, but these spaces are running out really quickly. Just another way of showing that construction starts. So this is, essentially when a building breaks ground. Only about 38 million square feet broke ground. So that's telling you that in about 6 quarters from now, there's only going to be about 38 million square feet of construction where completions, where 3 or 4 years ago, we were building like 100 million square feet per quarter. And this quarter was only 55 million square feet, which was the lowest in 12 years. Next year, it's even going to be lower than that. And so we are, going to rapidly deplete out of first generation space very soon. And I think some of these landlords are kind of banking on that, that are having space come up right now. And so maybe there's kind of like this wait and see, maybe my 2015 might not, lease right away, but when there's not that 2026 building competition, it might not be as much of a worry. So we'll kind of it's going to be a big storyline over the next few years.
Agreed.
Just a little bit here. So this is essentially the amount of supply that's left in some markets, for new buildings. And there's like markets like Phoenix, Indianapolis, Columbus. A year and a half ago, we were saying these markets are oversupplied. It's going to take years to lease all of this space. Now there's less than a year left of supply for new buildings. And that just showcases how much demand there is for new buildings that, essentially, if the market's going the way that it is now in terms of leasing, first generation space, and the lack of new supply, all of these markets within the next 2 years will have essentially nothing to lease for newer buildings. And that's just shocking. Yeah.
Phoenix, particularly Phoenix, the alarm bells were going off a year or two ago, very dire outlook. And now they've, absorbed so many of those large buildings. That's been a success story. And now I think one of your slides even shows quite a few new starts. Phoenix is starting to gear up with new buildings too.
There is some, but it's nowhere near what it was previously. And so well, there's some, it's not really accounting for the demand over the last year or two for those buildings. And so that's why we think that, even though because the vacancy on this chart includes what's under construction. So even what that 4.3 million square feet available, that includes the under construction. That same kind of building demand led to about 8.9 million square feet of leasing. So there's only 4.3 being replaced by what was been about 8.9 of demand. And so that kind of showcases that, yeah, there's some being built, but if the demand continues, which we expect it to, uh, given so many clients that are coming in the market, it's still not enough to keep up with that from a new building perspective. Rents are really tough. I will just say that I've never seen so much micro differences in the way rents are moving right now. Nationally, they're about flat, but on a street by street basis, rents are moving on huge different directions. And again, this has to do with the age of the building, the amenities in the building. And it's really companies are getting so detailed in terms of their needs that like the haves or and have nots of say, building specs and locations are creating like this huge difference in rents. But what we are seeing nationally is that owners are focusing more on occupancy by providing, say, more incentives to lease. Like there's much lower lease escalations now. Typically, there's a 3 to 4% escalation on a lease. In 2024, about 40% of all the comps in our system, which we have thousands of deals in our system, 40% of those had a 4% or higher escalation, which 5 years ago was kind of unheard of to have a 4% escalation. Well, it's unheard of, and now it's kind of becoming unheard of again because this year there's only been about 22% of leases that's had a 4% or higher escalation. And that's a little bit of kind of that relief, I guess, that landlords are providing occupiers now that, there's a lot more competition and they want to make sure that those tenants stay in the building.
Plus lower inflation outlook, although it's perked up a little bit lately.
It has for sure. Yeah. This is a lot of data, but lease terms a little bit lower. I think what's interesting is this next slide in that companies are preferring to sign longer renewals right now than new leases. And I think this has to do with some of much more incentives to renew right now, given again, we saw that all the space is being moved out of, right? So a landlord does not want to be one of those businesses or one of those buildings that's vacated. They want to keep that tenant in there and not be one of that part of that 400 million square feet of negative absorption. So they're giving much favorable concessions. They are, giving more favorable rents and free rent and things like that, and options in the lease. Also, it's expensive to move. That first generation space is starting to run out. And so companies are really just kind of honing in if they don't need a new building on signing, a really good deal for a renewal right now. Well, on the flip side, new lease terms are going down a little bit because one, we're seeing much more 3PL leasing. 3PLs tend to sign shorter deals because they tend to have shorter contracts with the end client. So that's affecting the overall average. Capital flexibility is part of it, not really wanting to, guarantee a rent payment for that long on their books. And then, there's still some of that economic uncertainty that's going on. So much longer renewals, much shorter new leases, which is definitely a change to what we see historically in our data. But, this is kind of a good chart for what we were talking about with the survey with cost, right? And so, yeah, rents have flattened. There's much more, incentives being provided. But you got to think over the last 5 years, rents have gone up significantly. We talked about rents going up 30% per year. And so we took a look at, say, a hypothetical lease 5 years ago, right? The average term is about 5 years. The average annual escalation is about 3%. So we went back and we figured out, okay, what was the average lease rate 5 years ago for each market? And we did a 3% annual increase. And we figured out, okay, what are they paying on the final year of that lease? And what is the market rent right now? And on average, if a tenant has a lease expiring, they would have to pay about 24% higher than what they're paying on the last year of that lease. That's the national average. These are markets where it's much more than that. So, say if you have a lease expiring in northern New Jersey, your renewal rate right now is going to be 86% higher than what you're paying. And so that's a lot of pain right there. And I think that's why you saw a lot of like, this is really a problem for us coming through on the survey. And so even though we could talk about supply chain costs, when you get a renewal rate on your desk that's 86% higher, that's going to affect your mood, frankly. And I think that's why that came through on the survey. But again, one big thing also to look at is there's been a lot more willingness to buy buildings, both from light manufacturers and from 3PLs to kind of mitigate against that risk of future rent growth. Also, there's a lot more technology going into buildings, a lot more machinery. You don't want to have to worry about having all this stuff in the building and then all of a sudden getting a renewal rate 70% higher 5 years from now. And then you're like, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to pay it because I don't want to move all this stuff. So if you buy the building, that kind of protects against kind of that future rent increase and you have a little bit more control over the building. And so because of that, we've seen a lot more tenants prefer to own compared with the
especially on the
last
smaller
couple of years ago.
buildings.
Yeah. Especially on
Mhm.
the smaller building. We have seen some million square footers get sold. There are some major retailers that have kind of looked at, also wanting to control the building, but really the bread and butter of user sales really is kind of in that 30,000 to 120,000 segment. And these are, again, a lot of regional manufacturing, a lot of regional third party logistics providers that are buying these buildings. So just to kind of go through these finally, there's a lot of markets where we consider more landlord favorable, and these are the areas where we're seeing rents grow up, supply going down, demand going up. So if all three of those are happening, we consider that to be a fully landlord market. 2 out of 3 is lean landlord, 1 out of 3 is lean tenant. All three going in the bad direction, it's a tenant favorable market. I would say right now, the most landlord favorable area is in the Midwest. This was a region that they stopped construction prior to some of the other areas, areas in the country. So it didn't have the population growth and whatnot. So they've had less of an oversupply situation for a little bit longer, and also a lot of the demand coming from 3PLs and manufacturing. So these are the markets that are very much just completely landlord favorable right now. We're also seeing a lot of great activity in, say, like the Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, North Carolina. And so you're starting to see some of those markets become more landlord favorable, which right now you could see these a little bit more this is the lean landlord favorable. So a little bit of tenant favorable dynamics here, but mostly landlord favorable. But again, really strong in the Midwest. And this is where you start to see those Carolinas really start to flow into the data. The tenant favorable ones, leaning tenant, are still a lot in the Southwest and a lot in the Southeast, where there was a lot of building to kind of correlate with population growth or whatnot. And so it's taking a little bit longer to get some of this space occupied. Southern California, all the markets right now are a little bit of a lean tenants. There was a lot of increase in leasing space from, say, port-centric 3PLs when inventories went way up. Now that they've kind of stabilized, we've seen some move outs there. We've seen some consolidations because there was such an over leasing of space. So from that standpoint, there's still some supply to work out, and because of that, rents have dipped in Southern California, and that's why it's a little bit still of a tenant favorable area. Same thing in New Jersey, Florida. Kind of, we've seen a little bit of a slowdown there. I think some of the weather and insurance related issues have kind of affected the market from that standpoint. Also, only a couple markets that are really not doing well at all. Seattle has had some issues with the ports and labor. Austin just significantly overbuilt, and also I think Savannah, when they saw that huge rush of imports, really, I mean, they essentially increased the inventory in Savannah like 30% in a 24-month period. I mean, that it was just a massive amount of development and just not even close to the tenant demand there to keep up with that. So that's essentially kind of the fundamentals, just our outlook. Again, a lot of record high leasing. I think the demand drivers are still there despite geopolitical uncertainty. There's still a lot of space coming up for lease expiration, so we definitely have to watch out for that. But I would say, kind of the big word of the year this year is functionality, right? If you have a functional building for today's modern occupier, you're going to do really well. If not, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made from that landlord as to what are you going to do with that building and how aggressive are you going to get to either lease or renew that space. 1.7, this is a big number, 1.7 billion square feet of space is coming up for expiration over the next 3 years. So everything that we're seeing now, there's really not any end to that anytime soon. So there's still a ton of companies that have to make decisions. There's actually more space coming up for expiration in 2029 than there is over the next 2 years. So this is, these are trends that might actually accelerate over the next few years. So definitely not really a change there in the market. We're seeing that occupiers are signing renewals much earlier in the term than they did before, again, because landlords are getting aggressive. We think that this will actually accelerate over the next few years. Uh, but again, the demand driver is still consumer expectations, having that resilient supply chain, even geopolitical uncertainty or just from costs, and then just optimizing your locations, a lot more use of technology and whatnot. And you need those modern buildings to do that. Manufacturing, data centers, cold storage, I think will be a larger part of the industrial story. It already is. Manufacturing's growing. Data centers is a huge component to that manufacturing growth. Still seeing some growth in cold storage also, but I would say the first two, manufacturing and data centers, will likely continue to really be a big story for specialty for overall industrial. And then, one thing that I do against my better judgment every year is I do a crystal ball prediction of what's going to happen in the markets. Uh, Groundbreakings might start picking up in 2026. We do still think that could happen, just given the huge need for it. But still a lot of build to suits. It's a little bit easier to get build to suits, loans and whatnot through because you already have the rents set and everything. Vacancy rates we do think will stabilize, not grow as much anymore because the construction is so low. Rents kind of, will remain very variable. But leasing we thought was going to be at 5%. First quarter came in much higher than we thought. So now our lease forecast is for +8, which again will be a record breaking year. So that's what we're saying. And again, I think all of this points to a really interesting product type in the market for sure. And so it's been a fun time for me to analyze this. So uh, yeah,
Yeah, it's not been boring since COVID in the
no,
industrial logistics space, that's for sure.
not at all. Yeah,
Well, James, this has been a tremendous high level look at the trends that are affecting the US market, not necessarily Southern California, but obviously you can see how they're affecting our local markets.
sure.
Really appreciate it. The industrial sector is so important because it sits right at the intersection of logistics, technology, manufacturing, demographics, and global trade. All
Mhm.
these things are having an impact on those markets, and your perspective on where those are heading is incredibly valuable. I want to thank everyone who tuned in to watch the Chapman CRE webcast, and special thanks to James Breeze for giving us his perspectives. We look forward to the next conversation with leaders shaping the future of commercial real estate. Thank you again, James.
Thank you.